All right, Ben. Well, thank you for coming on to Capturing Christianity. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, I'm really honored to be here. This is special.
Cool. So, today we're talking about a philosophical argument for God's existence. And for me, when I think about a philosophical argument, at least when I try to talk with an atheist or a skeptic about some kind of like philosophical argument, I get one of the objections that I hear is that we don't really, or we shouldn't like care about philosophical arguments. These don't really actually prove anything. What we really want is empirical evidence.
Mm.
And so, what's your sort of basic take on that? Like, what's your response to that?
Yeah, well, I disagree with that whole idea and that whole approach to thinking about arguments. I tend to view most academic disciplines as all of them, in some sense, being under philosophy as sort of the queen of the disciplines. And the medievals would have thought that theology, in particular, was the queen of the disciplines, even over philosophy. I'm sympathetic to that idea, but there are all kinds of subdisciplines of philosophy that most people don't reflect on and see them as a philosophical discipline, like mathematics. So if I ask you for a proof that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and you bring out 2 apples and then 2 more apples and say, see, there are 4 apples, a lot of people would say, look, that's empirical proof of this. And I'm going to say it's not, because the idea of what numbers are stands behind whatever objects you're bringing out to count with. And whatever
So,
the
what do you mean
nature.
stands behind?
I mean that we have numbers and we use them. And I mean, there's a debate amongst philosophers about whether numbers are real or whether they're abstract objects or whether nominalism is true and these are just social constructions that we have. But notice that even talking about that is itself not an empirical discussion, but it is a philosophical discussion. So when people just say, look, I can prove to you that 2 plus 2 equals 4 using this empirical method of counting apples, they're presupposing a lot of philosophy that has already taken place in the background, that they're just either unaware of or they're not critically reflective of it. And I don't mean to say that in any negative way, that people who are doing this are ignorant or foolish. That's not my contention. Rather, I just want to point out that there are all kinds of things about life that we don't have the ability to get empirical evidence about those things. I don't think it means that we shouldn't really care about those things. The idea that we should only value things that we can get empirical evidence for is a philosophical claim. It's not something that can be defended empirically. So are you familiar with scientism?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that there's something in the neighborhood of scientism that's at work here, that people think the only things that we should believe are things that can be scientifically proven. But the claim that you should only believe things which can be scientifically proven, that claim itself cannot be scientifically proven. So there's a kind of self-defeating attitude of a lot of this. So I just reject the idea that we have to have empirical evidence in order for anything to count as a good argument, whether an argument for the existence of God or an argument for the existence of something else.
So then let's go ahead and turn directly to the argument, which is the argument we're discussing today is the ontological argument. When I first came across this argument, I originally thought, well, there's probably something tricky going on here. It seems too easy. And then after I looked into it, I was like, this is a really strong argument, actually. And then as I kept looking into it and I looked at objections, I eventually came to the attitude that I don't know. I don't know anymore. And so I want to hear what's your favorite formulation of the argument, and then how do you go about defending it?
Very good. Well, it's important that you mention your favorite formulation, because there's not just one ontological argument. There are lots of ontological arguments. And there are ontological arguments for the existence of all kinds of things, but you and I are interested in ontological arguments for the existence of God or for the existence of a supreme being. And I think that the ontological argument is a successful argument, at least in certain formulations. Now, St. Anselm of the 11th century was kind of the first person to stumble across the argument and articulate it. And he said that God is the greatest conceivable being. Whatever it is greater to be than to not be, that's who God is. And For him, as he's reflecting on this in the proslogion, it's a giant prayer. So he's praying and starting to think about God and just tries to have these high thoughts, and he's reflecting on the existence of God and starts to think not only about the fact that God exists, but how God exists. That God is the kind of being that he's so wonderful and so grand and so marvelous that he couldn't fail to exist, is the claim. Now, for Anselm, all of this hinges on conceivability. And that makes it, in a certain sense, an epistemic argument as much as it is an ontological argument. And I have concerns about his formulation of the argument as to whether or not it's successful. But fast forward 900 years, and here we are in the 21st century. And in the late 70s, Alvin Plantinga developed an argument that's now called the Modal ontological argument. And it doesn't trade on the conceivability premise that Anselm's argument did. He said, not that God is the greatest conceivable being, but that God is the greatest possible being. Whether you and I can think about it or not, that's an ancillary question to the idea that something that's out there, of all the extant stuff, something is the greatest. Think of it as like a food chain, right? Something's at the top of the food chain, or something's at the top of the totem pole. And he thinks God is that. But not just that there's something out there that's at the top of the food chain, but that whatever actually is at the top of the food chain, it's not possible that that there be anything greater than that. And that whole idea is baked into the definition of who God is. So I've got more to say about that, but do you have any questions about what we've got right here?
No. I'm just I'm curious about the steps. Like, so is that the version that you defend?
Well, so the modal ontological argument is the version that I think is going to be the most successful.
Okay. So what like, let's just lay out sort of the basic steps of the argument so that listeners can sort of follow along.
Right. Okay. So the modal ontological argument trades on various conceptions of the metaphysics of modality. And we get into talking about possible world theory. And this is tricky. It's complicated. There's lots of different ways of thinking about possible worlds. In the contemporary literature, things seem to be decidedly in favor of a Plantingian approach to possible worlds, wherein when we talk about possible worlds,
we're not thinking about a possible universe, right?
That's right. So yeah, that's very important. This is not
an alternate reality.
Alternate realities, no. But they are ways of thinking about how things could have been. Now, before we turn our attention to the ontological argument, I think it's very important that we understand that there are these three different kinds of modal claims: impossibility, contingency, and necessity. And the way that we understand these is going to function importantly in the way that I want to defend the argument. To claim that something is impossible or to claim that something is necessary, that's a very strong claim.
Right.
But to claim that something is possible, that's not a very strong claim. I kind of think that we should default towards thinking that something is possible unless we have a good reason to know that it's not possible.
That's interesting.
Which would mean that it's impossible, which is a stronger claim. So, okay, so now jumping into the ontological argument, right? And just sketching it out very quickly. The key premise of the whole argument is just this. Maybe God exists. Maybe. Possibly God exists. It could be the case that God exists.
Right.
As long as you're there, as it turns out from the very definition of God, we get God existing. Because this, to state it formally, possibly maximal greatness is instantiated, right? Means that there is a possible world. It might not be this one. There's some possible world out there where maximal greatness is exemplified.
Okay.
Now, if that's the case, we just need to think about the concept of maximal greatness. And here, Anselm informs us that it's not just that God exists that makes him great, but the mode in which God exists also makes him great. So, God exists in some possible world out there, but we need to ask ourselves, is it better that God exists in some but not all worlds? Or would it be better for God to exist at all possible worlds? Would it be better that the modality with which God enjoys existence isn't a contingent existence, but a necessary existence. And I think just upon reflection, you would think, yeah, like a maximally great being would exist, not just accidentally or not just contingently, but of necessity. So if there is a world in which God exists in that world and God is maximally great in that world, then that world actually tells us about the whole modal landscape. It tells us something about all possible worlds. And it tells us that in all of those possible worlds, God exists. If that was not the case, if it was rather just the case that there's at least one possible world or maybe several possible worlds, but not all possible worlds in which God exists, then I want to say, well, what about a being that's even greater than that? What about a being that doesn't just exist in one or several possible worlds? What about a maximally great being that exists in all possible worlds? That being would then be superior to God. And that's a contradiction. Whatever God is the top of the food chain. So there can't be anything higher than that. There can't be something that's taller on the totem pole. In class, sometimes I'll talk to students and I'll ask them to imagine a supermodel that is the most beautiful supermodel that you can imagine. So the ladies have some idea of, I don't know, Fabio or Brad Pitt or something in their head, and guys have their vision of I don't know, Jennifer Lawrence or whoever the most beautiful person in the world is, and I say, now imagine somebody that's even more beautiful than that. Well, that person would then be
the most beautiful
possible, right? And what we're trying to get at is this highest, like that. It's not just that it happens to be at the highest, but the very nature of the highestness is that there is not even possibly something that's higher than that. So with respect to existence, that brings us to the concept of necessary existence.
Okay.
Now, some philosophers push back on this, and they say, well, you're baking necessary existence into the definition of God, and that becomes an issue.
There's a well, you hear a lot of these parodies. It's like, what about a maximally great pizza?
Right.
Like, wouldn't that have to exist in all possible worlds? Here's one that I want to bring to the table because I like Star Wars. So let's try to imagine like a maximally, what's the greatest conceivable Darth Vader? Like, wouldn't he have to exist in all possible worlds?
Right. Well, I would want to say, if there was a greatest possible Darth Vader, then maybe yes. But I'm not inclined to think that there has to be one of those things. There was a monk named Gaunilo who responded to Anselm when the ontological argument was first formulated, and he wanted to think of a greatest conceivable island, and why doesn't that exist? And I think that there are interesting puzzles that need to be thought through here, and it gets really complex. But it's not just the issue of necessary existence with respect to Darth Vader or islands or whatever. We also need to think through self-existence. I mean, I don't think that God is caused to exist. I think God is sort of a brute fact that exists of necessity, and I don't think it's right to say that God causes himself to exist or things like that. And I know there are philosophers who are a lot smarter than me who do think that's the right way to talk about it. But there's something different with respect to Darth Vader or an island and God, because part of what we're talking about when we're talking about God is the source of all being, the origin of every non-divine thing. And when we talk about the greatest possible being, and that kind of leads us to think about God, unless you think that Darth Vader would also have all of the properties that God would have, then there's going to be a relevant disanalogy. And I don't think that Darth Vader, at least as construed in the Star Wars films, is an omnibenevolent person. So I don't think he's going to meet the bill of what we're really talking about when we want to bring our perfect being theology together into play with ontological arguments.
Okay, so we have this first premise, which is like, it's possible, maybe God exists.
Right.
Possibly God exists. And then so how do we get to the conclusion that from it's possible God exists, that actually God exists? How does that
Right,
how does that
okay.
happen?
So to say it is possible that God exists is to say there exists at least one possible world where God exists.
Okay.
But in that one possible world where God exists, if God is truly maximally great in that world, then that means that God not only exists in that world, but God exists in all possible worlds. Otherwise, he's not maximally great in the one world that we're just kind of stipulating we think he exists in this one.
Okay.
Now, certain skeptics and atheists are going to want to get off the train right here and say, "See, yep, I right there. That's the problem." And so I'm just not willing to grant that it's possible that God exists. I'm not willing to say that. And then I say, okay, well, if you don't even think it's possible that God exists, well, then you're begging the question against God's existence from the get-go, because now we can't even have a discussion, because you're wanting to say from the get-go, I don't think God exists. Now let's have a discussion and try to figure out whether or not God exists. And then on the other side of the discussion, they find out, see, God doesn't exist. And I say that's begging the question, because right at the beginning you said, as part of the argument, God does not exist. I'm not even going to admit that it's possible that God exists. And then you have your discussion, and then on the other side you get to, therefore God does not exist. That's not an honest intellectual discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean it. I mean, if God doesn't exist, there's nothing wrong with starting there. But if you're trying to have a conversation about whether or not God exists, it begs the question.
Or you're trying to persuade someone else of your viewpoint.
Right. Whereas it would be equally problematic if you said, God exists. So we're going to start there, and then we're going to have a long argument about God's existence, and then we're going to say, see, God exists. Well, that would also be begging the question.
Right.
But starting with possibly God exists, I'm not stipulating from the onset that God does exist. That comes later when we cash out what the definition of God is and how the possibility premise helps shape our understanding of the modal landscape, possible world theory, and then we end up seeing that God is a necessary being and therefore exists at all possible worlds. It's not begging the question.
Okay, so one of the most pressing objections, and this is the one that sort of led me to where I am today, where it's sort of like, maybe this is a good argument, I'm not sure at this point. And this is what's called the reverse modal ontological argument.
Right.
And this one basically says that, well, hey, it also seems that it's possible that God doesn't exist. Like, that also seems possible.
Right.
But then if that's possible, if God is possibly not instantiated in some world, then it follows that God is not instantiated in the actual world. And so what's your sort of take on that? Like, how do you respond to the reverse?
So there's a couple of different ways that I want to respond. And the first one that I'm going to offer very tenuously, I'm still working on this and don't have it all quite worked out. There are other philosophers that I would encourage you to visit with, especially Joshua Rasmussen, who's a friend of mine. He's been helpful in conversations with him and my own thinking. But it seems to me that a few moments ago when I was talking about how we ought to favor the possibility premise as opposed to the stronger modal claims of either necessity or impossibility, that doesn't apply in this case, because we want to make a difference between what we call positive existential claims and negative existential claims. So if I say possibly God exists, that's a positive existential claim because we're talking about something that actually exists, as opposed to a negative existential claim, possibly God does not exist.
Okay.
And I don't know that we have a good reason to favor the possibility premise in the case of negative existential claims. So
can you give an example?
Yeah. So let's just think about like crazy possibilities, right? Imagine a world exactly like this one, but the sky is purple instead of blue,
okay,
right? Or green instead of blue, or whatever color you want it to be instead of blue.
My daughter's favorite color is pink. So
we're going with pink today then. All right. So if we think like, could it be that there's a possible world with a pink sky? Like, I'm not aware of any logical contradiction that is derived from that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, seems like I have a good reason to just kind of naturally favor possibility. But if we say something that has like a negative existential claim, like, is it possible that there's a world exactly like this one where the tree that's right outside, where that tree is not there? I mean, like, I'm not aware of anything that makes that tree a necessary being. So I might I might have a good reason to think, yeah, here's a case where there's a negative existential, and I have a good reason to just kind of generally think, in this case, it's okay for me to say, yeah, it's possible that there's a possible world just like this one without that tree. But I think things are different when we talk about negative existentials and God, because I think that the sentence, there is no God, is itself a contradiction, because God, in the sentence, it defines an idea, right? And that idea is a maximally great being, and a maximally great being exists necessarily and therefore exists in all possible worlds. So for someone to say, there is no God, is to say, the greatest conceivable being, the greatest possible being, the being that exists in all possible worlds does not exist. And that's just a contradiction. So in those cases, when somebody wants to talk about negative existential claims, I don't see any motivation to accept the possibility premise for the atheological modal ontological argument.
So just so I think you mentioned that you had two responses to that.
Right.
So what's your second one?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm really excited about this. This is some of my own current research. With respect to the atheological argument, I don't think we have a good reason to think that the statement possibly God does not exist is true. But with respect to the statement possibly God does exist, I think we have lots of reasons to think that that statement is true, that proposition. One is just this, the very idea of God and the way that it cashes out in the ontological argument. But you might say, well, hang on a minute. Before we run the ontological argument, we're really trying to figure out whether this premise that the whole thing hinges on, like, should we accept that premise? And I say, good point. We don't want to beg the question here. So why should I think possibly God exists? So it's not clear to me that all of the other theistic arguments get you a maximally great being, but they get you closer to that. So the Kalam cosmological argument, it gets you a really powerful being, but it's not clear to me that it gets you an omnipotent being. It does get you a personal being, and it also gets you a being that exists of necessity. So the being that's the conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument has this in common with the ontological argument. They are both necessary beings. So there's some overlap there. So what I want to say is, if you're somebody who's reflected upon the Kalam cosmological argument and you think maybe that gives you some evidence for the existence of a supreme being or the existence of God, well, then that ought to kind of like raise your credence level in the idea that possibly God exists is a premise worth taking seriously, and then running the ontological argument. I think the moral argument, I think the only kind of being that could serve as the ground for necessary moral truths would be an omnibenevolent being. So if you think you can get an omnibenevolent being that exists of necessity out of a moral argument for the existence of God, then that also is going to raise your credence level back over here on the ontological argument that maybe God exists. And so one of the ways that I want to defend the ontological argument is, maybe God exists. Why should I think that? Here's all these arguments. Now come back over here and go, yeah, I guess it does seem reasonable to think maybe God exists. And then you run your ontological argument and you get the end. So you might be aware that there's a new book coming out later this year, 24 or so arguments for the existence of God. It's an homage to Al Plantinga and his very important work.
And wasn't that edited by, I think, Trent Doherty and Jerry Walls?
That's right, yeah.
Right, so it's coming out, when did you say?
I'm not exactly sure. I know that it's in production right now.
Soon-ish.
Right. But I was at Baylor when they hosted a conference for this and had a chance to talk to Al about some of these things. And I asked him, like, what do you think about these kind of cumulative case theories? And he said, well, I'm just worried that some of the other arguments, they don't get you a necessary being.
Okay.
And Bill Craig was there, and he said, well, what about the Kalam argument? And Alex Proust said, what about the argument from numbers? And as it turns out, there's a lot of these other theistic arguments that get you a necessary being.
Interesting.
So the way that I want to approach the discussion, you can kind of see the ontological argument serving as the bookends of several arguments. So just run this really quickly.
Okay.
Ben, why should I believe in God? Well, here's the ontological argument. That's a good reason to believe in God. Yeah, but why should I believe in the ontological argument? After all, it hinges on this possibility premise, and I'm not sure about that possibility premise. And I say, well, it's kind of the whole concept of God that we're talking about. I'm not interested in talking about some lesser being. I'm interested in talking about God, so it's right there. And because it's right there, here's your ontological argument. And they go, yeah, I see it. I'm still not convinced. So coming back again, I get that the concept of God that we're playing with here in this possibility premise would lend itself towards the ontological argument, but I'm worried there's something fishy going on here. So what else you got? And I say, here's all the other arguments. And in light of all those, that's why you should believe in God. And they go, yeah, I'm not sure yet. And I go, but what do you think? Do you think it's crazy to believe that God might exist? And they go, no, looking at all those arguments, I see how like it's possible that God exists. And I go, cool. Now we're coming back over here to our ontological argument. You've just said, in light of all these other arguments, possibly God exists. And now we run our ontological argument. So we started and ended with the ontological argument, and we had lots of fun in between with the other theistic arguments. That's the way that I want to approach a Bayesian framework of thinking about ontological arguments.
I really like that. I think that has some potential. So there was a back and forth, I think it was a show on Unbelievable between Peter Millikan and Peter S. Williams, and they debated the ontological argument. And one of the objections that Peter Williams brought, and I don't think it was like one of his biggest formal objections to the ontological argument, but he made mention of the fact that the ontological argument is accepted by a minority of philosophers. So does that like weigh heavily in any sense, or like should we take that as like how should we?
It really doesn't bother me at all. There are all kinds of strange views that are defended by a minority of philosophers. And one of the things when we are doing philosophy is you want to practice a certain kind of open-mindedness. It's not a popularity game where we're going to say, oh, well, that view is not allowed to be under consideration because there's only a few people. This is not, the American political scene where the Green Party only has like 5 members and so they never get a seat in Congress or whatever. When we're doing philosophy, we want to consider everything that is possible. So we look at the total logical space of available options when we're trying to think through answers to any particular question. And so I don't see why the ontological argument shouldn't be considered as a possibility any more than any other argument for or against the existence of God should or shouldn't be under consideration. So I just couldn't care less that there's a minority of philosophers who are attracted to the ontological argument. And there's something that we could say about the history of philosophy here. It wasn't all that long ago, within the last 50 years, that virtually all professional philosophers were atheists. And then, the landscape changed. Alvin Plantinga made a whole bunch of arguments concerning the rationality of believing in God if you believe in other minds. So the choice is you can be a solipsist, that's one view, and then you can think that it's just totally stupid to believe in God. But if you do believe that there are other minds, well, for all the same reasons that you would think it's rational to believe in other minds, for those same reasons it's rational to believe in God. And that sort of got the ball rolling towards a revival in metaphysics that we've seen in analytic philosophy that's come on the heels of the death of logical positivism and some other problems in the early 20th century. But if anybody was to say back in, say, the 1940s, like, should we take the existence of God seriously? And somebody was to say, well, of course we shouldn't, because that's held only by the tiniest minority of philosophers, then the massive gains that we have seen in metaphysics and theistic metaphysics over the last 60 years wouldn't have ever happened. And I'm thankful that when we're doing our philosophy, we don't say no view is allowed to come to the table on the basis of the fact that there's only a handful of people who think that this is a legitimate idea. So I'm not worried at all.
What do you think, like, is there something rhetorical going on there? Like, why do you think that he gave that sort of like, even if it wasn't a big objection that he gave, why do you think he made mention of that?
Well, I think we should be tenuous about these things. I recognize that I'm defending a view that's a minority opinion about some of these things. And it does bother me that the world's best and brightest don't see things this way. That does make me want to think, well, am I missing something here? Am I miscalculating? Have I forgot to carry the 7 when I was doing my math? So I don't think that it's I don't think that we have good reason to be just entirely dismissive of the fact that nobody believes this stuff. At the same time, I don't think that because nobody believes something, we shouldn't take that idea seriously. But I've become very comfortable being in the minority. I mean, I'm a evangelical, born-again, God-fearing, Jesus-loving, Bible-believing Christian trying to make my way in academia. I'm a minority there, right? I'm a Berkeleyan idealist. There's only like 7 of us on the planet, right? So that's a minority view. So, and I happen to think the ontological argument is a pretty good argument for the existence of God. If that turns out to be a minority view, just chalk it up to one more of Ben's weird views. So, yeah.
So, all right. So here's I guess a last objection. Maybe we can look at some others. So here's one way that you could maybe try to motivate the reverse premise, like that possibly God does not exist.
Right.
Some people have wanted to say that God's existence is impossible because his attributes are contradictory.
Right.
Maybe there's like 2 attributes he has, like perfect mercy and perfect justice. These 2 attributes seem to contradict each other like directly. And maybe we don't have to focus on those 2, but what's your take on that? Like, how do you resolve that kind of?
Okay, so I want to expand the question because Eugen Nagasawa's recent work on this, now published with Oxford, called Maximal God, addresses these kinds of questions. And Eugen thinks that there are 3 different kinds of arguments against the existence of a maximally great being. One kind of argument purports to show the inconsistency or the self-referential incoherence of any like single great-making attribute.
And I'm thinking more like when you mention married bachelor, sort of the same lines?
Slightly, but different. So let's consider omnipotence, right?
Okay.
The idea that God is all-powerful, that God can do just anything, right? Well, if God is all-powerful, then he can create a rock that's so heavy that not even God could lift it. I mean, if he can't do that, then there's something that God can't do. But if he can do it, if he can create a rock that's so heavy that not even God can lift it, well, then once he creates the rock, well, now there's something that God can't do. So no matter how you think through the puzzle, it looks like God can't really be omnipotent. So that's one kind of argument against the idea that there even could be a maximally great being. I think there's responses to the paradox of the stone. But that's just one of the kind of arguments. Now, the second kind of argument that Eugen gives is what you're talking about. And he says, so an omnibenevolent being, a morally perfect being, well, that being can't sin. But an omnipotent being is all-powerful. Like, clearly it's possible to sin. So it sure seems like you couldn't have a being that is simultaneously morally perfect and all-powerful. And then there's a third kind of argument that says, hey, look, one or more of these great-making attributes is incompatible with some contingent fact about the universe. So the problem of evil is sort of the paradigmatic example of this kind of argument. If God is all good and God is all powerful, then why is there so much evil in the world? Well, Eugen's response to all this is that rather than respond to each and every version of some anti-theistic argument, let's take a more economic approach and just say, God is whatever the greatest conceivable being is. So maybe omnipotence and omnibenevolence are incompatible. I mean, I'm not saying that they are incompatible, but maybe they are. Fine. So do the trade-off, and whatever is better to be than not be, that's all I need in order to get my ontological argument to run through. Because something's at the top of the food chain. Something actually is the greatest possible being. And it's silly to think there couldn't be something that's at the top of the food chain because there's some other thing that's even higher than that that's not logically possible at all. That doesn't give us a good reason to think that there is no God. It rather gives us a good reason, if any of those arguments are successful, and I don't think they are, but if any of those arguments were successful, it gives us a good reason not to think that God doesn't exist, but rather that the God who does exist is not that kind of God. It's some other kind of God. God has this nature, not that nature. Now, I have worries about this kind of economic modification, and I have a paper that's under review right now that raises some concerns about what the modifications might lead to. But I think Eugen is right that arguments that purport to show the incompatibility of multiple attributes don't establish that God does not exist. It rather just establishes that God might be a little bit different than we think he is.
Very interesting. Did you have any last closing thoughts about the argument or about?
I mean, just not necessarily about the argument itself, but about the nature of perfect being theology, and the way that this has helped me in my own life intellectually, but more importantly, like in my own devotional life, and really just taking time to meditate on the greatness of God, that God is magnificent and He's good and He's true and He's beautiful and not just like a little bit, but like a lot, like maximally so. And it makes me happy to think about God. And I think we should do that more. And I think we should allow ourselves, even in our imaginations, to just run and think like God is so good, He's so big, He's so awesome, He's so maximally great. And allow that to shape what we think, not only about God, but about the kind of world that God has created that we get to walk in. The idea that we have the opportunity to be in relationship with this being, the idea that a maximally great being would condescend to us, would reveal himself to us, would come to us in the person of his Son and live a perfect life and never sin, and love and show us how to love so much that we hated it and we killed him. And he bled and died on a cross, shedding his blood for my sins. And then that God would raise him from the dead 3 days later, showing that he's defeated death, inviting us to commune with a maximally great being. I mean, there is no better story to tell, except to make sure to add that it's a true story. Thinking about the greatness of God and thinking about the maximal greatness of God that we get from perfect being theology and ontological arguments, together with the Christian story of the gospel, the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus. It's a practice that's important, not only because we care about the life of the mind and we want to make sure that we're loving God with all of our minds, and we want to make sure that we are not being conformed to the patterns of this world, but we are being transformed by the renewing of our minds. We want to make sure that we are growing in the grace and knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. It's not just the intellectual focus. There is a real heart focus on this that I just want to encourage Christians to think hard, not just for the sake of thinking hard, but for the sake of knowing God and walking with God and being loved by God.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining me today. It's been awesome.
Thanks for having me.
So,
It's really been fun.
Awesome. Is there any last things that you wanted to say, or?
No, I wish you the best in this. This has been fun. I hope that your ministry really flourishes and that we can encourage Christians to think hard about things that ultimately honor and glorify God.
Awesome.
So.
Until next time, we'll see you guys later.